Oh,
Thank you, everybody, for coming to join us to celebrate Nicole's incredible memoir, A Living Remedy. It is so amazing to get to celebrate it, and we see a lot of familiar faces here, and it really feels like an awesome community that we have here in DC. So let's give a round of applause for that. To start off, Nicole, Nicole is going to read a passage from A Living Remedy.
thank you so much. This is from the very beginning of the book, so I don't have to give you any setup. I can picture her, one pale freckled cheek resting on the yellow floral patterned pillowcase next to mine, warm brown eyes half lidded with sleep as she listened to me talk. She was often tired in those days. After walking in the door, she'd greet me, drop her purse in a chair, and then go lie down for a while before dinner. Sometimes I'd follow her down the brown carpeted hallway to my parents' room, the second door on the right, and chatter at her from the doorway, or my dad's side of the bed. She'd respond now and then, ask me the occasional question. If she fell asleep, I'd tiptoe away. When I was little, we'd sit side by side on her bed while she told me stories about her girlhood, taught me my prayers, got me started on early cross-stitch and crochet projects, and read me stories she loved. A Little Princess, Anne of Green Gables, Pride and Prejudice. By the time I was a senior in high school, I was mostly just looking to talk, to tell her about my day. Tests I had coming up, the school musical I wanted to try out for, plans my friends and I had made for the weekend. I probably should have known to leave her in peace. She wasn't in good health then, which I did not fully understand. No matter how exhausted she was, she never sent me away. I wonder if she ever thought about how soon I'd be leaving as the two of us lay on that squeaky old mattress, late afternoon sunlight filtering through the sheer brown curtains. I wonder if that's why she always let me gab when she got home from work, why she didn't tell me to go away and let her rest. Soon, we'd no longer be sharing a roof, and she wouldn't hear much about my individual days, only the sum total of whatever I could remember after a full week of classes and papers and dining hall meals, on a Sunday afternoon phone call made with one of dozens of calling cards she mailed to me. We would still belong to each other, but we would come to know one another differently in separation, in parting after parting. I didn't know what it would mean to leave, wouldn't begin to grasp it until my last night in my little blue childhood bedroom a few months later, when I found I couldn't sleep for terror and wonder. I had spent most of my life in a small house in a small town, a Korean adoptee who knew I was loved, but often felt as though I were living a life meant for someone else. The dreams of escape had long held me in thrall. I missed my parents when I spent any considerable length of time away from them. And my mom was the person I most wanted to talk to at the end of the day. I'm sure plenty of people who knew me were surprised such a homebody, only child, had set her sights on a life 3,000 miles away. It would be years before I would understand that she was the one all along who had been preparing me to go, who wanted me to have the choice. I think of those late afternoon talks with her now that I have my own children, knowing that the days of both of them falling asleep in their rooms down the hall from mine are dwindling, that a time will come when something trivial or life-changing will happen to them. They'll be hurt or caught by surprise or find that they're happier than they've ever been, and I will not be the first person they tell. That might be why I sometimes let them stay up past bedtime, chatting with me or getting silly with each other. Why even the brightest moments on the best of days can crack my heart wide open. But then sometimes I think, well, no matter where they go, no matter how far apart we are, maybe I will always be someone they think to call, someone they want to talk to. Because my mother's far beyond my sight, beyond the reach of my voice, and not a day goes by when I don't think of something I wish I could tell her. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing, and also, again, for writing this gorgeous book. I remember when you sent me an earlier draft, and I got to read it early, I was so floored because I've known you for years now, and we've been friends for a while, and I've seen the way your voice has changed and shifted as a writer, from All You Can Ever Know to A Living Remedy, but also to the essays that you've written. And when I read A Living Remedy for the first time, I was so struck by the strength and voice in here, and I found it really powerful. And I'm not sure if any of you have read the memoir already out here in the audience, but you're in for such a treat. It is truly beautiful. Yeah, it's special. I suppose, so when you're writing it, so much of this memoir is about the American project, of what it means to get sick, but also what it means to care for a loved one. And I related to that, and I think so many people here will. What was really guiding you as you were writing this book?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, and you know this as a memoirist, of course, the events are set, and you can't really embellish those core truths at all. But it was interesting, like, one of the things that really drives me to write in this genre actually is curiosity. And with this book, I did not actually know either how I would write it, especially during a pandemic, or how it would end. I remember with my first book, things were so set.
Yeah.
Not that you don't discover a lot, and not that I didn't discover a lot in the process of writing that first book, but for better or for worse, it was very settled matter, and I knew beginning, middle, end, when I sat down to write. And this book, I really didn't. It was very scary, and I mean, I'm glad to be that much further along, I guess, in my writing career. In some ways, it's a much more far-ranging, far-reaching, ambitious book, and it really terrified me in some ways. But also, that was part of what drove me, was can I do it?
Right.
And the curiosity, where is this going? And is there something I can say about these huge universal themes that touch everybody, about illness and grief, and what it means to grow up and leave home, and what it is to try to parent your parents, all of those things. Can I say something, if it doesn't always feel new, is there going to be something for readers to hold on to? Will it matter to anyone else? What can I add to these ongoing conversations too, about getting sick in this country, getting old in this country, caring for elders in this country? And it felt like an enormous challenge, but it was one I was really curious to see, can I do it? Can I make something that matters out of this experience? So
Right.
I think
And
that
also,
was the big question.
Yeah, how do I shape something that is so personal into something outside myself? I mean,
Right.
that's something that you and I have talked about a lot. It's so hard, and it's so vulnerable writing memoir too, because it's your life, but also it's in a way, it's art.
I mean, it is, and it's funny, I have a million stories about people finding out that I've written a memoir, but one of my favorites is a neighbor who was like, I read your book, and now I know a lot about you.
Yeah.
I was like, yeah, that's true. I think you should reciprocate now.
The calculation of whether or not to say you've written a book,
Yes.
because you know it will lead to.
What kind of book,
What kind
Kat?
of book? What's the name? Oh, let me Google it right now.
Yeah.
Oh, about your family.
Yeah, it's about your life, and
Yeah.
how interesting.
Wow.
Yeah.
And you're just like,
Yes, it's true. But it's kind of funny because I've been thinking a lot about this because this is the start of the tour, and it's the beginning of really talking about this book as a public object. And it's the point where, as a memoirist, you lose control of, this is how it should be, but it's just one big long process of losing control of how the audience, how readers, and you are who the book is for. Like this is the right thing to happen, but you lose control of like what people choose to take from it and what it means to them.
Yes.
Like those experiences, they're still yours, they're still mine, those still belong to us, and we can still define them as we always have for ourselves. But we've also made it into, as you said, art. And that you don't control people's reaction to.
No, you can't, unfortunately.
In a way, it's actually really reassuring though,
Yeah,
because I'm
it
like, well,
is.
I'm not responsible for like, or like even if someone like doesn't like it or doesn't get it, it's like, well, I mean, I put it out there,
Yeah.
and I wouldn't want to control what people take from it, but it is like really interesting. Even the process of like, for instance, like reading even positive reviews, it's just wild. Like it doesn't get less strange to read those as a memoirist. It's like,
Yeah.
let's review your life.
Let's summarize it
right.
into a couple neat paragraphs.
Right.
But I think also there's something about being seen, whether or not somebody likes it or whether or not somebody is engaging. Well, the goal is to have somebody
Right.
engaging with something that you've made, which is really neat. And it's also strange and interesting when it's your life. Did at any point in the writing process, who you were writing this for shift?
I mean, by the time I'm going to write something for like public
Yeah.
consumption, I am always writing kind of for the reader, which isn't to say I'm not important. And of course, as the author, like I am the one sifting through memories and deciding like what to, but it's still kind of reader focused. What do they need to know or understand to understand the stakes, to care, to follow me on this journey, to let this book keep them company in a sense. So, I mean, I don't want to say like I wrote it all for readers, because there's a lot of me and a lot of like my soul in this book.
Yeah.
But I was thinking about, I mean, not like takeaways, that's a little too simplistic, but what could make this book matter, this story matter to other people? Like what will make them not even think about my life and what happened to me, but their lives and what's happened to them? Like, I think when memoir really succeeds, it's because it's made us think about like our own experiences. And in the case of this book, I was hoping people would think about like their own losses and their own loved ones, things that we sometimes don't take the time for.
Yeah.
There's a lot of sort of grief that is really hard to face individually and collectively right now. And so I wanted this book to also be space where people could do that.
I think you really took, I mean, this is something my editor always said, making the personal universal. And you really did that. And I mean, one of the things that I think you write about so effectively throughout your work that I've noticed over the years watching you, even on Twitter, have conversations with friends about the cost of college and how to really, the sacrifices you make financially in order to just live or survive and thrive, is class. You write about class so well. And I think when I first started reading this book, I was really thrilled to see a memoir grappling with how expensive it is to watch a loved one become sick and the types of sacrifices we make. I mean, I saw that in my own family as a child. I for sure did not understand what was happening to us
Right.
until I became an adult and tried to write about it. But to have that sort of lens from you writing it for us, I was so happy to see that. Happy is not the right word, but can you talk about why that was so important and how you sort of treated that decision?
When I wanted to write about grief, I knew I couldn't tell this story and specifically how we lost my father and when we lost him at the age of 67. And I could not really write about my grief or even separate it from these issues around, I mean, class, yes, inequality and healthcare, and the fact that, you know, we have one of the most expensive healthcare systems in the world, and like we still often don't get what we need. And there was just no telling this story without like tackling that head on. I didn't really set out to write necessarily about class or about politics or about like the healthcare system.
That'd be a tall order.
Yeah, right. But it was sort of like this in this story, and not just this story, but like so many people in this country. Like I just know it's such a common experience, and I didn't see that in a lot of grief memoirs, and yet most people in this country are not amazingly wealthy. And so even like the very lucky people, we face illness and we face loss, and we face our elders growing older and needing more support, like with very strained systems of care, with huge gaps in the safety net. It's like there's what you can do and there's like what they need, and the gap between is so wide, and it just gets wider, you know, the fewer resources that you have. And that was just part of our story. So it was something I wanted to be able to write about. And I mean, to your point also, like, just like you as a child, like I did not really understand.
Yeah, for sure.
So much of the book too, I think, is about the slowly accumulating like body of knowledge you get as a young person, and a young person in this country, about these systems, about where your family is, about what kind of situation your family is in, like what you have and don't have. And no one is really saying this to you. No one is really sitting you down and explaining, like, you know, like this is what we have and this is what we need, and this is why we're struggling, especially parents who are trying to protect you. So a lot of what I wanted to explore too was just how these ideas like congeal in our minds. You know, from the time we're very young, and you know, how we basically learn about our family and our place in the world, and unmet needs through what is not said, you know, more than what is really said.
Yeah, I feel like so much of writing a memoir also is revisiting these memories and reevaluating, you know, the stance at which you look at them from. And I mean, sure, there's many vantage points of truth, but to be able to see it from your parents' perspective, and to be able to see documents that reveal different financial situations or something of that nature, it kind of changes the way you live your life, and it changes your narrative. And I think that's really, it's striking, and it's hard. One quote that, and I hope, can I read back
please.
a very short passage to you, that I found really beautiful was, observation and anticipation were among the first and only tools I had to defend myself. And so I was the sort of kid who was constantly on the lookout, measuring the delta between me and everyone I knew, between desire and reality, between the sense of safety and belonging I wanted to feel and what I actually felt. When I read those sentences, I was so struck by the ability to do so much in such a compact sentence. First of all, as a writer, I was like, that was a really good sentence.
Thank you.
That was excellent. But also, I felt really seen. And I think that, you know, observation and anticipation as a tool, it's so powerful. And I think that's one of your greatest gifts as a writer: observation and anticipation and empathy, I would say. But the delta between me and everyone I knew, I think that often in your work, you do such a great job at having, you know, showing this tension, but also showing this compassion for everyone you approach in your writing. How do you consider that when you're writing about other people?
I mean, thank you for that.
Yeah.
I think it depends. It obviously depends on like the closeness of the relationship and how much information I actually have. I mean, I don't think of this as like a reported memoir, but like you mentioned documents before, and I didn't actually sit anyone in my family down and like interview them, but I was always like a very active listener, and I always had a lot of questions. I mean, I talked so much from a very young age, asking questions that like a friend of my mother's was like, who had 4 children, was like, if Nicole were my first, I would have just stopped at 1. And she didn't say that because I was like ill-behaved. She just said it because like I was always like, if I was awake, I was talking to you and asking you questions. So that actually has served me really well, like as a writer. But when writing about the people I know, like, again, it goes back to curiosity. I'm always really interested in what I don't know, or what I think I know, but like I could have a different perspective on. I mean, one of the big things that I think comes through every time we write about our families and our parents is like, how well can you ever truly know your parents as their child? And yet, like, my task and yours was to really render them as like whole people. And yet we know them in this very like one particular
This
way.
finite way. Yeah.
So you're trying to widen the, is aperture the correct term? Sorry. But like you're trying to get like a
Camera.
different view, a wider view on people where you think like you could write a book about them and you know everything that would be in it. I really wanted to know like what don't I know about my parents, or what have I just never considered? And not just them, of course, but because this is so much their story and like the story of my grief for them. I mean, that was my focus. In some cases, actually before my mother got her terminal diagnosis, like I was talking with her about some of these chapters. She like was able to confirm things and tell me stories like about my dad's childhood that he had not told me, but like she knew. And like I hadn't considered, I admit I had spent very little time considering my father as a child in a house where his mother was very sick. And I had not thought of that as like a point of parallel, like between us, until my mother started telling me these stories. And by that point, he was dead and gone. But like she was still carrying these stories and these memories, and still like she was able to shift my perspective on him, even though he was gone. That was really powerful. And so approaching the rest of the book and them as people, but also as characters, because that's what memoirs do, is turn you all into characters.
It's true.
It's true. Like, I really was like, what don't I know? And what do I still need to understand? And what, again, back to the readers, like what does a reader need to understand to care about this story, to care about how and when I lost my parents? And then to bring that back to their own lives and their own relationships. So a lot of it really is just like questions and more questions.
One of the framings, or one of the sentences that you even said during the reading, was something to the effect of, preparing to leave your home and realizing that you would then have to shift your relationship with your mother, and the two of you would have to learn how to be together but apart. And I think that is, in a way, what the whole project of grief is.
That's so true.
It's just trying to understand how you are in relation to the person who is no longer there, and how your friendship, how your parental-child relationship can evolve.
Right.
And I think that you do that so well, and the love that you have is really clear. I was actually really moved. So I didn't grow up religious. And so reading the passages in your book about your parents' faith, it really moved me in a way that I was surprised by, because I think that often, we're always looking for community, and we're always looking for a way to move forward in times of uncertainty. And I saw that. Can you talk about that process of why it was so important to write about faith?
Yeah, I was kind of surprised. I've never really done that before. I don't know, it just sort of snuck up on me in this book. But on the other hand, it would have felt so strange and like false to try to write about my parents without writing about that, because it was like the foundation of their lives together, and how they raised me, and very much like what sustained them. I don't even just mean their faith, like in a comforting sense. I mean that community that they were part of. I saw the way they came together when my father was sick and after he died. And then when my mother was sick, she entered hospice care right at the start of the pandemic. And so I wasn't able to be there physically, but she had like essentially another family, another community there. And like, I'll always be grateful that they had that. I wanted to be able to explore community, a word that is used so often that sometimes it can like lose meaning, I feel. But in their case, it's true. And like, I think there was so much in that community I saw of like support and mutual aid, and knowing they can't make my parents' material or health situation better, just like me. Like they couldn't like shoulder those burdens or those costs, which are astronomical. But like sometimes giving aid and comfort is just asking, how can I maybe reduce this person's suffering or be with them in it? Like, is there anything I can do? And it often doesn't feel like enough, but it is something, and it is so important. And I don't know what would have like become of them if like that community hadn't been there for them. And it just felt very important to just acknowledge that in a way. And it made me think too about my own spaces and like relationships and communities, like thinking, what do I have and what can I give? And also kind of what did I give up when I left this small town, like left that church I was raised in, and like what is that, where am I finding like community in other spaces? It's just something that I wanted to be able to like explore.
Yeah. I think also you write about that really well. I mean, just in terms of the friends that you lean on and the people who come into your life, and your mother's friends especially, who become such pillars of strength. But also, I think you write really effectively about another dynamic and relationship where in the memoir, you are both mother but daughter always. And these are dualities that you can just never, take apart. And I think I definitely saw that in a way that your first book didn't have. And was that an intentional choice, or how did that come about?
I mean, the relationship between my mother and me, and then like her as mother, me as daughter, but me as a mother, and then also like taking over sort of a caregiving or responsible role when she gets sick. That is like the emotional heart of the book. When the book was actually originally, it was going to focus more on my father and like the injustice of how he died so young, and how his death was really sped by like precarity and lack of access to healthcare. And then I had already started working on that book when my mother got very sick. And at that point I knew the whole like terrain of the book would need to shift. And when I sat down months after her death to basically start over from the beginning, I realized like really it should begin and end with her. Like she'd always been there. She was, I don't want to say like my link to my father, because I had a very close relationship with my dad on our own, but especially after he died, like what I mentioned, her giving me these memories and these stories that he'd never told me. Like she was still my link to him. And she was kind of the family storyteller before I was. So I knew that was at the heart of the book, and I wanted to be able to explore, like at the beginning, we're very much in a parent-child role, and then things begin to shift. I think one of the interesting things about the relationship arc of ours in the book is that we were really just beginning to figure out what our relationship was going to be after my father passed. And we had not figured that out when she got sick. And so, our relationship in a very short time went through like a lot of huge changes, but it was also during a crisis. And so our relationship wasn't like the emotional focus for either of us. It was like both so essential and yet like not the focus. And I wanted to give that more space and more room and ask more questions about it in the book, because I knew even at the time how important this was. And I used to feel foolish for obsessing about our relationship. Is my mother mad at me? Like, does she resent my interference? I felt silly for worrying about this when she was literally dying, but I did. I worried about it because everything about our relationship felt like it had changed, and I couldn't like keep up. And I think that's probably a relatable challenge for many people who found themselves sort of in an elder caregiving role. But in our case, we were still adjusting to like widow and widow's only daughter when this happened, when she got sick. So I don't know, that felt like very like rich and important ground to cover in the book. And it was hard at times, but it was also like another way of spending time like with my mother and with those memories.
Yeah, I think the moment when a child becomes a caregiver to their own parent is always such a shift in relationship where you can't really go back after that. And it's also really powerful, and it's so vulnerable because everyone has to, well, not has to, but everyone, at some point acknowledges it. And it's just another life stage. I think we're wrapping up, and all of you might have note cards, and we'll be getting them soon for Christine to read out loud. But my last question for you is, while you were writing this memoir, what were some of the things that you kept returning to over and over to read, to watch, to listen to as either inspiration or something to sort of be a change of scenery?
That is a great question. So most of the whole book, it was rewritten during the pandemic. And a lot of it, I want to say pre-vaccination, like, so I was not going anywhere. And so my life was pretty small at that point. I remember I was reading a lot of poetry, and that was about what my like pandemic brain could handle in terms of like like length. I also just really love poetry. Poetry is like my go-to for like shaking out of writer's block. Like the thing about poetry is it's always exactly what you personally need to read in that moment. It's amazing. I read a lot of like Ocean Vuong and Ada Limon, and like the late great Linda Paston was really important to me. She's written like so many beautiful poems about death and about grief. And I quote her book, her poem "Death of a Parent" in this book, but it was very important to me. So those are some things. And like I read, I got to read a lot of beautiful books as well during the pandemic. Sorry, I need to fix this. Sorry. Yours was one of them, like a very beautiful meditation and story of grief. And then Brian Washington's Memorial was one of the first novels I was reading, like after my mother died. So like those are some, but I would say like poetry more than anything else.
Definitely. Poetry was also what I turned to.
Yeah.
It just seemed...
Like which poets?
Diana Coy Wynn, Ghost of, is this wonderful collection about loss, about her brother who passed. And it was so comforting.
I can't believe I did not mention Marie Howe, but the title of the book is actually from a Marie Howe poem. There's a line she wrote called "Because Even Grief Provides a Living Remedy," and I asked her for like permission to borrow that phrase for the book, which she very graciously gave me. She's wonderful, but all of Marie Howe's books, and in particular her collection "What the Living Do," incredible. So that's another one I read a lot.
I didn't know that was the origin of the title. That is a beautiful story.
Yeah.
Wow. We'll leave it there, and I think we'll take audience questions, but thank you.
If you haven't passed your note cards, please do so. And I have a couple to get us started. So A Living Remedy felt very raw and recent after the death of your parents. Do you think your approach to writing it would have changed if you'd written it a few years later? And how different do you think it would have been?
So I actually met my editor for the very first time just earlier this week in New York. And at one point she said something and I was so like amused and like thankful she acknowledged it, like just the pressure of a publishing deadline. And I did move my deadline several times, by the way, but she was like, I know if it had been up to you, you would have probably waited like at least another year to start it. And I was like, that's true, Helen. Like I would have.
Come on,
but
Helen.
I'm actually, I mean, I'm really, it's not to say I didn't actually love the writing of it, because in some ways, like this is the freest I've ever felt writing. I'm really grateful actually for that experience, but it's very recent, right? It was very raw. There were times I was writing about like my mother especially, and just like crying during the writing, which is like not a typical thing I do while writing. I think my approach though to this was like, despite my deadline, like shockingly, I don't know, healthy, if that's the word. I really tried to like take care of myself and take breaks if I needed. And if I could not write on a day, like I just didn't write. If I'd written a really hard scene and I needed like a few days to sort of recoup or work on some part that was lighter, I did that. So in terms of approach, I hope I would have been able to do that, like writing a few years on as well. As for like what the book would have been like, it would be completely different if I'd written it, let's say like, I don't know, a little bit earlier, or certainly like 5 years from now, 10 years from now. Like the events in the book might be the same, but I would be a different person. How I thought about those relationships, my perspective would keep shifting. So a memoir is always like about a set like time in your life, but it's written by you, and it's a product of like who you are at the moment you write it. So I don't know, there could have actually been like a better moment, maybe like 5 years, but there is something in the immediacy, I think, in the urgency. I actually think some of that comes through in the writing in a good way. It was definitely a lot, but I think any book about my parents' losses would have always been a lot. So,
and I think it's such a, oh, sorry.
No, you go.
It's such a time capsule, too,
Right.
of your state of mind. And I think any memoir, any good memoir, is almost like this revealing of the writer's voice and their point of view and how they see the world. And I think that that was, I mean, I'm sure we've talked about this too. It's sort of what makes writing memoir so wonderful.
It was actually, not to like go on about this, but I remember with my first book, it was sometimes really hard to access and like feel and then transfer the emotion to the page. Because many of the events I was writing about with All You Can Ever Know had happened 5, 10, or like 30 years earlier. And this book, so much of it, yes, there's parts from childhood, but a lot of it really was like from like the last year or two. And I didn't have to dig deep to find that. I could remember like that time when my mother was sick during the pandemic and I couldn't get to her, like that will like live in my body forever. And like I just knew how to write those parts, those chapters. I don't know if that would be the case necessarily. Like it would at least be different. I think it would feel more settled and maybe less urgent if I were to write it 5, 10 years from now. But I don't know. I wrote it now because I had asked for several deadline extensions. And it was definitely time.
Fair enough. How would you encourage newer writers to approach stories revolving around their own life, especially that balance of self-examination and craft with compassion?
That's a great question. I mean, I'll take a stab, but I would love to hear you chime in as well, Kat. I mean, I think, first of all, knowing that you don't actually owe the world your trauma or your grief or the hardest things that have happened to you, and that I also worked as an editor for many, many years, and you know, was pitched like many, many beautiful stories and essays about not just grief and trauma, like many other things too, but like almost every single piece was like deep emotions, and I got very good at telling when people were not like quite ready to tell a given story. And I don't mean that to sound condescending because I have been there. I have been not ready to tell a story. And it happens to all of us. I think forcing yourself or pushing yourself like to keep your butt in the chair and write. I mean, I know I hear that writing advice over and over, but sometimes you need more time and often you need more care. Like learning to be gentle with yourself. And then also recognizing it's not really enough from a craft perspective to write what's happened to you for you. I mean, that's very valuable, and that's kind of what journaling or other types of writing are for. But once you're going to put it out there in the world, I mean, a big question is, what is the reader going to hold on to? Like, why will this matter to them? And if you're not quite ready to go there and think about that, that might be another sign that you need to spend a little more time with it. But yeah.
Yeah, I would say also one thing, whether I'm working on a piece of reporting or even for seeing ghosts, honing and figuring out the one large question I was trying to ask, and whether I was asking it explicitly or just sort of putting it out into the world as I was writing, having something to write toward,
Right.
whether it's a short story, whether you're writing fiction or nonfiction, that will help anchor you, and you'll understand where everything is driving toward. And if you're able to, and the question can be simple, it can be, what do we owe? Or who is my mother? Or who is my father? And once you sort of ask that question out loud or on the page, it can open up so many different avenues, and it can help structure your work too.
I love that. I feel like for so many, especially like people just starting out in memoir and personal essay, like the big question is like, why am I like this? And like that's actually like a really great, it's a question we all ask ourselves like all our lives at different stages for different reasons. And it's okay, it's a really personal question, it's an important one and it's worth asking. But again, like just like thinking about why am I like this, and like, you know, what is there for readers? Like why are they going to like want to know?
Yeah.
And how will it make them think about their own lives and what they're like and why? But I love that. I love that like answer. It's really helpful.
Thank you. How do you think being an adoptee shaped your response and feelings about your parents' death? Whoever asked this question, as a fellow adoptee, as their mom ages, you know, thinking about the ties to their family and their stories and how that might change when the parent's gone.
Yeah, I mean, I admit I didn't necessarily expect, I think I don't have anything to compare it to, like being adopted or not being adopted. So I experienced grief as an adoptee, and I don't know what it would be like, I mean, to have lost biological parents through death. I mean, I've sort of lost them already through adoption. I was not expecting, though, to to think so much about that first adoption loss, like while I was losing my parents. That was like a shock for me. And like something, like the most simple things, like a neighbor said something to me like, you know, trying to be comforting, like you'll always see your father and your children, or like, and I in my case will not. But I kind of knew, I knew what she meant. And just like all these little things would come up. I remember telling like my favorite cousin, my adoptive family, like when he called to ask how I was doing, when my mom was really sick, I was like, it sort of feels like being unadopted. It's almost like, sometimes I felt really like bereft or like abandoned, almost like, you know, and again, it was a callback to like that sort of that first abandonment, like that first loss of my birth family. But then eventually my perspective on it shifted, and I came to realize like, it's not really like I haven't really lost them or the adoption. Like the way they raised me and loved me, all that still matters in my life. It still shaped who I am and how I'll keep living. But yeah, sorry, I'm like rambling a bit. I know being an adoptee like impacted my grief, and at the same time, like it's hard. I don't really have anything else to compare it to, so I don't know like what it would have been like otherwise. But it definitely brought up a lot.
I know for me, like when I lost my father, you know, the process of grief changed me like on a cellular level. Like I am a different person now than I was before that. This isn't my question, but I'm just tagging onto it. Did writing during the grieving process change the way you wrote? Like, and if so, how did it change like the method or the style as opposed to like writing beforehand?
That's a good question. I didn't necessarily realize it at the time, but I think I sort of entered like this almost meditative state while working on this book. And I mean, it's not like I was free writing, because I knew like the good stuff was going to go in the book, but like I would sit often and write without like sometimes without a destination, like without a lot of pressure, like just kind of seeing what came to me and like letting the memories flow and trying to remember how certain, I never really write like how I felt. I tend to write more like how did this moment feel in my body, because I don't know, that's what I was trying to do, is like put myself back in these moments. It was kind of a new experience. I haven't had a writing experience like that before, where it almost felt like it felt very meditative, and it felt very free, actually. And I don't know if that was because of the grief, but it might have been. Like it might have been because it was so fresh, and these stories and these words were kind of coming out of it. I don't know. Again, like I think the main way grief affected my writing was sort of in the process, where I just had to learn how to like trust myself and take care of myself and have a different relationship to my work and my writing than I've had ever. And you know, I think both of those things were really crucial, that sense of freedom and that sense of trust and care. I don't think without any of those things, this book would exist or would be the book that it is.
For both of you, do you journal, like, or did you, when you were writing the book, was it really more about like bringing up the memories, or did you go back to any journals you had in the past?
So I am not as frequent of a journaler as I was when I was younger, but I do still journal. And I crucially like kept one from like age 6 until like well after college, like almost daily. And so I did consult some of those and like cringed a lot. But like that was like valuable source material. So I specifically remember looking at my high school journals because there was so much going on in my family at that time. It was really a time of like health and financial crisis, but again, no one's saying this to me, so I'm reading and trying to read between the lines of my own journal, figuring out what I knew and what I didn't know, and what was I thinking about, and what was I not worried about. So that was like actually a really important source for me.
Yeah, journaling for sure. I wrote a lot on Blogspot and Blogger.com and LiveJournal, and so I actually
LiveJournal,
went back and found those accounts and then somehow deleted them. I don't know what happened. So that actually was not as useful, but because my sisters and I extensively emailed each other, there would be moments where sometimes I would ask them questions, and one sister, the very industrious one who works in tech, would then search her Gmail inbox and find something from like 2003
That's a
and then
good sister.
screenshot it to me and send it to me.
Amazing.
It was amazing. It was also mortifying and
Yeah.
cringe. But yeah, records are great. Keep all of your records. Keep everything if you want to write a memoir.
Right. I also looked at journals from when my parents, like my father was first getting sick, and I had like quite a bit. I mean, most of those journal entries are like about my children who are very, very young. But like, yeah, the parts with my parents, it was really helpful for the timeline, like to
Yeah.
make sure I had the timeline correct.
For sure.
We'll just have two more questions
Okay.
before we wrap up. How did the writing and research process for this book change in your relationship with, and the change in your relationship with your mother changed the relationship with your daughters or how you identified as a mother yourself?
I mean, it's always changing. God, parenting's really hard. And I have a teenager who's like wonderful, but like I feel like it changes daily. And okay, so even though my parents died just 2 years apart, I feel like how I grieved as a parent like was very different, and what my kids saw and were aware of was very different. And I try not to say like a lot about them publicly, but I think the main difference in me like as a parent was I learned broad strokes. I would say with my father's death, I thought I had to keep these things separate, like parenting and grieving, and like didn't want to freak my kids out. They didn't need to see me sobbing or like screaming all the time. And just like I really felt like I had to keep it kind of separate. I used to joke that half an hour after their bedtime was like my crying time, because I was like, I have to schedule it, you know, that's, and for better or for worse, like, I mean, by the time my mother died 2 years later, they were always home with me because it was like spring 2020. Like there was no hiding, there was no like scheduling of grief. It was just, I don't know, I think we all had a chance to kind of just be with that and be together. And it was really hard to be grieving in isolation, but at the same time, like, I don't know. I don't want to say that was like an extended bereavement because I was working and they were doing Zoom school, which is the opposite of bereavement. But like we were all together. We were like grieving her and remembering her. And there was no real pressure in the way there often is after a loss to go out and like be in the real world again. There was no real world to go to. So I don't know, like I would go on a lot of long walks with my kids, and you know, eventually we got this dog, and that was like our grieving process, and we did it together. I felt like those two parts of my life, parenting and grieving, were a lot more integrated the second time, and didn't feel as strong of a need to like hide certain parts of my grief, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And for our final question for the evening, for both of you, who were other writers' memoirs or works that you read or that inspired you during your writing process for your books?
I specifically try not to read other memoirs when I'm working on like a personal story, because I kind of just don't want other people's like true story voices in my head. I read like fiction and poetry when I'm writing memoir, but I already mentioned Kat's beautiful book as like one of the greatest grief memoirs I've read. And yeah, I mean, I don't know. Do you want to chime in? 'Cause
Yeah,
feel
I
like-
read I read a lot of memoirs
Yeah.
when I was writing mine.
That's good.
It was, I mean, sometimes it was good, and then sometimes it would be like, wow, now, I mean, what's the point? Should I just give back my advance? What am I
That's
doing?
kind of what I was afraid of, honestly. I was just too cowardly to, confront that.
I really loved Sarah Broom's The Yellow House. I
Yeah.
thought that was just an excellent study in journalism also. Now I'm blanking. I mean, I read a lot of memoirs. Oh, Tikira Madden's Long Live the Tribe of Fatherless Girls was just magical because I was always seeking things that didn't quite have structure. And
Crying
some-
in H Mart.
Yeah, Crying in H Mart.
And Catherine Schultz's Lost and Found. Yep. I had to save that to read after I finished my manuscript, but I did really like it.
In a way, Jakira Diaz's Ordinary Girls is I mean, anything about just the really vulnerable time in your life where it means to lose anything, I think I was drawn to.
I mean, again, and I know this isn't memoir, but so Brian Washington's memorial, I read it after my mom died and just sobbed.
Yeah,
But it was also like that book kept me company in a way that felt very healing. And then Julie Otsuka's The Swimmers, and was another book. I mean, again, literary fiction, but I mean, I love that book so much, and it amazes me what she does in that space. But yeah, that book meant a lot. The mother-daughter relationship.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For Brian's book, I had my dad read it.
Oh my
and
gosh.
It felt in a way really special to be able to, I mean, he read my book also, but to give him something that, had similar themes of grief, but wasn't quite our family story.
Yeah.
And that was really powerful. Yeah, Memorial by Brian Washington.
Yes. Thank you both so much for this incredible conversation.
Nicole.
I have just a couple quick little housekeeping things. Please give us a moment. We'll be doing the signing upstairs on the 5th floor. Please don't rush the stage. If you'd like to take photos of Nicole and Kat, we'll take a couple of pose photos in just a moment. We will have the signing line, as I mentioned, on the 5th floor. We have books for sale if you'd like to get yourself a copy or some for your friends or family. And then just a note, we won't be doing posed photos in the signing line, but you can take candid ones. Thank you all for being here tonight with us. What a beautiful, beautiful book. Thank you. So I'll just have them stand and take some photos.
Yeah, I would just try to make it